the third speaker of this first session, and that is Abigail MacBain, who is currently a lecturer in pre-modern Japanese studies in the Department of Asian Studies at the University of Edinburgh. She obtained her PhD from Columbia University, where she also taught in the Department of East Asian Languages and Culture. Her dissertation, Precepts and Performances, Overseas Monks and the Emergence of Cosmopolitan Japan, is about the relocations of several Buddhist monks from various parts of the Asian mainland to Japan in the mid-8th century. And the subject that she's going to speak about is South Asian faces and traces in 8th century Japan. I must say, for most of us who go to Japan, I think the association with Nara is very strong because of Bodhisena. I think it's the first, at least documented Indian that we know who was there, and the association then with the Taibutsu there, and the ceremony, the eye painting ceremony and so on. And from there really starts, as far as we know, the documented history between Japan and India. So we really look forward to hearing your talk. And at the end of it, I hope you will take a few questions also. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Can I check first that everybody can hear me?
We can hear you. Thank you. Yeah, we can.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And thank you. Actually, the topic of my dissertation was also inspired by Bodhisena, and just trying to figure out how did an Indian monk arrive in Japan in the 8th century. And so today I want to discuss a little bit more about what I have found out about the life of Bodhisena, but also about how his Indian origins and 8th century Japan's awareness of India, including the different geographical layouts of the 5 Indias, influenced his rise to prominence. And then in later medieval periods, especially from the 10th to the 14th centuries, how that Indian connection influenced later stories involving Bodhisena. So to cover some of the basics, I think that Bodhisena is generally known for 2 things. The first is that he is the first documented Indian to go to Japan. There are some other records of Indians washing ashore, but these are largely seen as being either, in some cases, they're later creations or just maybe a scribal error. So at the very least, he is the first one that we have documented evidence for going to Japan. And the eye-opening ceremony is, of course, what he is most known for. There is another notable accomplishment, which is that he became the Sojo, which is the superintendent for the Ministry for Monastic Affairs in the year 751. So this is the year before he conducted the eye-opening ceremony. What this means functionally is that he was the most prominent Buddhist monk in Japan. He was in charge of the ministry that oversaw the entire monastic population in Japan. Whether he really interacted with it administratively or not, I do not know, but at the very least, he was the face for the Ministry for Monastic Affairs. So I want to very briefly discuss my sources for talking about the historical background for Bodhisena. And I have a article mentioned at the very bottom of this slide here of Kojima Yasuko, which goes into more detail about not only these sources, but other sources that also talk about Bodhisena. So when we're looking at these 3 particular sources, it's interesting as well to note what each one discusses and what each one does not. No one source talks about all of these historical details with Bodhisena. From the Shoku Nihongi, which is, of course, the historical records of the court, we only look at Bodhisena insofar as he interacted with the court or with a ruler. With the Todaiji Yoroku, which are the temple records for Todaiji Temple, we particularly see him in relation to this eye-opening ceremony. In fact, the only mentions of Bodhisena actually painting in the eyes for the great Buddha come from the Todaiji Yoroku. And then finally, we have the I'm covering my own slide here, the Nantenjiku Baramon Sojo Hi Narabi Nijo, which from here on forward, I'm going to be mentioning just as the Sojo Hi. This is arguably the most influential source that we have for Bodhisena. This was written about 10 years after his death by his own disciple, who is a Chinese monk called Shurong. So we have a very close connection, both in terms of Bodhisena's timeline, as well as a close connection from the subject matter to the writer. And so I think that the content from the Soljohi is fairly reliable. And it is in the Soljohi that we see the family name, how Bodhisena came to go to Japan. Also the episode of his meeting the Japanese monk Gyoki, which will be of great importance in later medieval stories. And then also a little bit of insight into some of his religious practices and his death in the year 760 and subsequent burial on Mount Tomi, which I will also talk about a little bit later. A fourth category of texts that I'm using are called satsuwa. These are medieval tales. They're a very, very loose category. They tend to be very short. Sometimes they're funny, or sometimes they are talking about miraculous events. A huge portion of these texts relate to Buddhist topics or individuals. And so that is the part, the category of the satsuwa that Bodhisena stories falls into. And so when we're looking at those stories, there is a distinct change in how the relationship between Bodhisena and Gyoki is portrayed, as well as the rationale for going first to China and then to Japan. So to roughly the rough overview of the historical events that we know of Gyoki, there are relatively few. From the Soljohi, we hear that he was born into the Bharadvaja family. In Japanese, this is called the Barachi clan. It also distinctly states that he was part of the Brahmin caste. And that Brahmin association is actually very important in Japan. In the historical records, he is continuously referred to as the Brahmin monk. The Brahmin monk Bodhi is a very, very common way to refer to him. And then in the Soljohi, of course, it also identifies him as coming from Nantenjiku, or southern India. What this actually means, where this actually is, that is a point of contention. I'll talk about in a few minutes. At some point, he became a monk. And at some point, he went to China. We do not know why. Around the year 733 or 734, he met a Japanese envoy to China, Tajihi no Hironari. He was the ambassador to Tang China at this time. And the Soljohi says that he was very impressed with Bodhisena, and he invited him to go back with him. It's worth noting that Bodhisena was one of multiple foreigners who returned with this Japanese embassy. Others include the Daoshuan, who was a precepts master, and also a monk that in Japanese is known as Butetsu. And the records state that Butetsu came from Southeast Asia, an area called Rinyu, that conforms today with northern Vietnam. There's a lot of uncertainty about Butetsu. So put into a Vietnamese sense, his name could be Pha Triet. I've also seen his name described as Buddhastira from a more Indian context. And we also do not know exactly what his background was. One record says that he brought a Siddham primer with him, and so that he contributed to teaching Siddham and Sanskrit. Also, he is credited with introducing a number of dances and musical styles from northern Vietnam. But when we actually look at some of the kind of context of those musical pieces, some of which are still performed in Japan today, there's a suggestion that maybe there are Indian elements there. And of course, as was just being mentioned, we do have this very close connection between Southeast Asia and India. And so some of the ambiguity about Butetsu can come from that. And so we don't necessarily know whether it's Southeast Asia or whether it's India, but that ambiguity also lends to the sense of the interactions happening at this time. So Bodhisena arrived in the year 736. We don't know exactly when he arrived. That's something that the historical records are strangely vague on. There is a mention of a number of Chinese individuals arriving. So Daoshuan would be included in that group, and maybe even Butetsu. It also states that there was an Iranian who arrived. And so potentially the scribe could have made a mistake with Bodhisena's origins, but then a few passages later, there's an Iranian identified by name. So it's very strange that Bodhisena would be left out, especially because of how prominent this Brahmin connection and providing this direct link to the Buddhist homeworld was. So we do have a passage in 736. In fact, it's right after the description of a number of individuals from China arriving. And it states that Emperor Shomu gave Daoshuan and Bodhisena seasonally appropriate robes. So we know that he arrived by this time. We just don't know which ship he necessarily arrived on or exactly which month he arrived in 736. This is also where he meets Gyoki, and I will talk about that episode a little bit later and how the Soljohi portrays it compared with how later Satsuma changed some of the language. He becomes the superintendent in the year 751. The eye-opening ceremony happens in the year 752. We also see Bodhisena appearing in the historical record in the year 758 for Empress Kolken's abdication. And his speech is still recorded in the Shoku Nihongi, although it is so full of references to Chinese and Japanese literature that I think that there's a reasonable expectation that his followers that may have also contributed to the construction of the speech. But at the very least, the record states that he gave this speech, and he helped to contribute to an honorific title that was given to the abdicated empress, that notably when she came back to power a few years later, she actually kept that part of her name and took that name as her reign name. And then the Soljohi states that in the year 760, he died. And at that time, his body was taken to Mount Tomi, where he was buried at Ryosenji, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a moment. These items, I think a lot of people who know about the eye-opening ceremony are very familiar with them. But for anybody who does not know, these come from the Shosoin Repository, which is a storehouse located immediately behind Todaiji Temple, which is where the Great Buddha is. And the Shosoin actually contains multiple items that were used for this eye-opening ceremony. It's really an extraordinary resource. And according to their records, this is the brush, and this is the cord that Bodhisena used to actually paint in the eyes of the Great Buddha. So in the Todaiji Yoroku's most notable record of the eye-opening ceremony, it states that Emperor Shomu, who was a retired emperor by that point, wanted to be the one to directly paint in the eyes and thereby kind of activate the Buddha. But he could not because of his ill health. And so he asked Bodhisena to do so in his stead. And then the record states that there was a long cord attached to the brush that all of the attendants, including the royal family, held on to. And in so doing, they were able to also contribute to the painting in of the eyes and therefore benefit from the merit developed from this extraordinary event. And then here we have the image of the kind of small stupa that's supposed to indicate where Bodhisena was buried. I believe he was cremated and then the ashes were put here. There is a very interesting story involving Bodhisena at Ryosenji. According to their foundation tales, Gyoki was given the task of building a temple on Mount Tomi, which is just outside the borders of Nara City. And on their way back from arriving at the port and going to the capital, they stopped off at this temple that was still under construction. And Bodhisena looked around and said, "Oh gosh, this reminds me so much of Vulture Peak." And so that he supposedly requested the emperor name the temple of the Holy Mountain, which is the Japanese term for Vulture Peak. And I'm going to be mentioning this connection between Bodhisena, Vulture Peak, and also the Lotus Sutra continually throughout the legacy aspect of Bodhisena. So there's some things that the historical records do not tell us, and these have led to a number of just questions on one hand and also just unclear information. One of the biggest ones is just, what do we mean by Southern India or Nantenjiku? So one theory is that this means the southern part of modern day India. So I've seen a number of secondary sources say that he came from the Madurai area. The other theory is that no, southern Tenjiku actually just means the entirety of India. And this is because the geographical understanding at this time of Asia outside of East Asia basically is that there were 5 Indias. You have a northern, southern India, and the southern India is basically from the Himalayas down. And so from that understanding, southern India could be anywhere. And this is the understanding that was used by the Setsuwa riders in the medieval period. And so instead of looking to the southern part of the continent, they actually looked to the northern part and to the part that the historical Buddha was from. And so the hometown that is credited to Bodhisena, not in the historical documents, not from the Soljohi, but rather from the Setsuwa, is Kapilavastu, and in particular the area around Vulture Peak. Another topic that's not covered is why and how he went to China. Did he go through Southeast Asia? Did he go over the Himalayas? It's not clear how he went there or why he went there. This is another area that the Setsuwa actually chose to explain. Why did he go to Japan? The historical records don't tell us that. They tell us that he was invited, but it's a rather large undertaking to move to another country for the rest of your life. So we don't know why he chose to do this. But again, the Setsuwa provide that explanation for us. And then finally, exactly when he arrived. This is not directly addressed in any of the records, but we do again have the episode of his arrival at the port of Naniwa and his encounter with Gyoki being very, very much emphasized in the Setsuwa. So I do want to talk a little bit about that Bodhisena, even though he provided the first direct connection that Japan had to India. In fact, no Japanese individuals went to India until the 16th century. But there was still certainly an awareness of India, both through Buddhist sources, but also through more cultural forms. These two masks come from a form of drama called Gigaku, and the subject matter of the Gigaku masks tend to be very much connected to Central Asia and South Asia. So these two masks, one from the 7th century, one from the 8th century, are supposed to represent Brahmin characters in this Gigaku drama. So that means that by the time that Bodhisena arrived, there was already a perception of what a Brahmin was supposed to look like. And that might be part of the reason why this Brahmin connection was so emphasized in the historical records. Now going into what some of the themes that the Setsuwa address. So why he went to China. Again, we do not know why he went to China, but the Setsuwa have provided an actually fairly reasonable explanation for this. And this is building upon a common understanding that was already in place by Bodhisena's time, that the Bodhisattva Manjushri lived on Mount Wutai in China. The reason for this was that his Pure Land of the Snow Mountain was associated with Mount Wutai. And so the Japanese scholar monk Enin, in his travel diary, actually talks about meeting Indian monks on Mount Wutai. And there's a very famous story of an Indian monk called Buddhapalita from the 7th century, that he went to Mount Wutai and he met the Bodhisattva Manjushri, who was disguised as an old man. And that's what's depicted here in this image. So that Buddhapalita story was basically just adopted and put into the Bodhisattva narrative. However, there was a slight but important change. In the Bodhisattva narrative, in the majority of the Setsuwas that include this, Bodhisena goes to Mount Wutai, encounters an old man, but the old man does not transform into Manjushri. Instead, he says, Manjushri is not here anymore. Manjushri has gone to Japan. And so in this narrative, we have both the explanation for why Bodhisena went to India, and given the historical context, that might actually be true. He could have been going to Mount Wutai to look for Manjushri. But it also provides insight into, it kind of foreshadows the meeting with Gyoki, but also corresponds with a common trend happening in medieval Japan, where elements from the Buddhist homeworld in India were shifting towards Japan. And Japan was being emphasized more, not as a peripheral country, but as a Buddhist center. And there are even descriptions of mountains just up and flying over and setting themselves down in Japan. So the idea of Manjushri leaving China and going to Japan is very consistent with other Buddhist texts that we have at this time. So looking now to this encounter with Gyoki, in the Soljohi, which again is the biography written by Bodhisena's disciple 10 years after his death, in this account, Bodhisena does not say anything, but it's only Gyoki who speaks. And what he says is, he refers to a passage in the Lotus Sutra where the Buddha states that the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara will appear in the form of a Brahmin if anybody needs to see him as a Brahmin in order to be saved. This is just hidden in the midst of a longer text of all the different forms that Avalokiteshvara could take. But this is the point that is emphasized in the Soljohi. And so in saying this, Gyoki, well, at least Shurong, through Gyoki's voice, is saying that Bodhisena's arrival is the culmination of this vow. And he's also suggesting potentially that Bodhisena could actually be Avalokiteshvara in human form. And like I mentioned, we have already seen connections with the Lotus Sutra, with the location where the Lotus Sutra was preached, which was Vulture Peak, and with Bodhisena already. We saw this with Yoro Senji Temple in particular. Now, by the medieval period, this narrative has changed quite a lot. And it's actually been very consistent throughout the different Setsuwa, that they largely are using the same language. In this case, we have a two-part waka exchange between Bodhisena and Gyoki. And Gyoki starts off and states that we are meeting each other after a long, long time. And this is a result of the vows that we exchanged on Vulture Peak in front of Shakyamuni. So now it's not just a matter of Bodhisena coming from India. Gyoki is stating, oh, we met each other. We knew each other in another life on Vulture Peak. We were there at the time that the Buddha was preaching, including texts such as the Lotus Sutra. And then in response, Bodhisena says, yes, this is a result, our meeting is a result of those vows that we exchanged in Kapilavastu. Manjushri, I behold your face again. What this means is that he is saying that the Manjushri that he has been looking for in China not only is in Japan, but is actually Gyoki. And then several of the Setsuwa finish off with saying that the people all around were now able to understand that actually Gyoki was truly Manjushri in human form.
Professor?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, just wind down. I think we have another speaker. Thank you.
Yes, I'm so sorry. I'll finish right up. So this is just very briefly a chart of the different Setsuwa and compared with the Soljohi, and you can see the different themes here. But ultimately, when we're looking at Bodhisena's life and activities, we see some element of Indian influence that could explain how he rose to this very high point, especially the theme of him being a Brahmin. But it's really after his death that we see this theme of the hidden nature and being able to unveil that hidden nature of Manjushri in Japan. So thank you very much. I'm sorry I went over.
Thank you very much. No, that was really fascinating. I know questions have been raised about how he went, whether he went directly that is via China. But, a lot of Indian monks at that point of time, Buddhist monks were traveling to China. So was it via China? Was it via Southeast Asia? And this fact of being a Brahmin, I think even today, perhaps in Thailand, in some countries, they do have, Indian Brahmin priests who are very much part of the Buddhist tradition. So I think it might have been a continuation of that. I think we're really very, close to, we're really not quite keeping to time. So I'm going to ask for one question, and then we must invite Professor Gillespie, who's really up here, up at some unearthly hour, I think, because he's in the US. Any question? I think not, and that's not because they're not interested, but I think, Bodhisena really is, as I said, the most tangible connect that we all have with Nara. And I was wanting to ask myself about this the Kokufuji temple, and there you have Vasubandhu, these statues, which of course supposed to have been from the 4th and 5th century, but did they really go or didn't they go? There's a lot of questions between, there's no documented evidence. But thank you very much. It was very, very interesting. Thanks so much.